My name is Ato Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. I will be the host of each episode. Each episode of Contours will address a pressing issue, theme, or concept in 21st century literary studies. In many of these episodes, I will be hosting a dialogue with an author or authors from the Cambridge University Press List. Others will feature a panel of experts in the field, and I will introduce that episode also. We aim to provide an invigorating, accessible forum for critical debate and reflection to engage and help students, teachers, and general readers. Contours will range from medieval literature to the present day, from all areas of global literary studies in the northern and southern hemispheres. Each episode will be approximately an hour long and will be available via YouTube on our new Contours page on Cambridge Core. We are joined for today's episode by Ian Smith, the Richard H. Jr. 1960 and Joan K. Sell Professor in the Humanities at Lafayette College and author of Black Shakespeare, Reading and Misreading Race, and Professor David Sterling Brown, Associate Professor of English at Trinity College, Hartford, Connecticut, and author of Shakespeare's White Others. We will be discussing their two fantastic books today. We hope you find this episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies, Hour useful, enjoyable, and relevant. And more importantly, that you'll be encouraged to join us again for the next edition. All right, gentlemen, we should exchange some wonderful Shakespearean greetings. Forsooth, oh Cairo, you guys greet. Forsooth, yay! You two brilliant men. So Ian has, I've had the privilege of seeing Ian in action on Contours, an earlier episode dedicated to Black Shakespeare. But David joins us for the first time. So what I'm hoping to do is I will set up a lively dialogue about the issues that you are both dealing with. But for to start with, why don't each of you give us a brief introduction to the work you're doing in the books, what brought you to the subject matter, and so on, starting with Ian.
Thank you, and happy to be here with you, and thanks for that really nice introduction. And David, I'm glad to be here with you too. David and I have known each other for a long time, so this is a great deal of fun. Just one quick correction. I am no longer at Lafayette College. I am a faculty member at USC, so I want to just make sure that the university gets its recognition.
I was reading it off the book, of course. Thanks for the correction.
Things happen quickly. Black Shakespeare, what do I say? There's several ways I can start talking about this. One is to talk about what motivated me to write or to think about writing such a work. The thing for me would be the issue of denial. Denial for so long has been crucial to the formation of early modern critical race studies. It is because when we think about the field of early modern race studies or pre-modern race studies or Shakespeare studies, for such a long time, race was not even a fact to be considered. It was simply something that was erased and so on. And so, of course, the work began with various people in the 90s to think about what that might be and to do that work. So there's always been that, and that has continued. It's not as if that has just been forgotten. Which is not to say that we need to return to that moment of origin. That's not the point. The thing is, it's still a living part of what we do. And I want to underscore two or three points, references that then help us understand why it was important to sort of still think about that. One has to do with a sort of history of thinkers who have situated this idea of denial as central to not just Shakespeare studies, but thinking about United States in general. And so in that way, I want to situate Shakespeare not just within the sort of narrow confines of an early modern precinct 400 years ago, but to think of it much more widely and then fully engage with who we are today and what we're doing. So we have, for example, from the 50s, James Baldwin talking about that in America we're a culture that we don't want to confront race. And in fact, so the phrase he uses is to talk about that we sort of look away from matters of race, right? So this sense of avoidance. Toni Morrison, of course, is a critical player here too. And I'm thinking in particular of her work, Playing in the Dark, where she does also address this issue of this sort of erasure to some great degree, and refusal to confront Blackness and what she also calls the Africanist presence in sort of American history and culture. And then more recently, Ibrahim Kendi says quite, I think it's very deliberately and almost confrontationally, he says, the heartbeat of America is denial. And so we have those sort of voices who sort of make that claim. And then we have more recently the attacks on CRT, on critical race theory, which is, if anything, a very stark reminder of the role of denial that is not just limited to literary studies or sort of what some might see as a niche area of study, Shakespeare studies, but which doesn't relate to sort of the broad American populace. Well, here it is that the attacks on critical race studies and critical race theory tells us very directly that there is this ongoing refusal to allow us to even think about, question, raise the issue surrounding race in America. And part of that, I suspect, is because, and I think it's more than a suspicion, part of that is because critical race studies are in fact, raising and pointing to those very questions that relate to white supremacy in this country, that those who are perpetuating this anti-CRT movement want to preserve that very white supremacy. So in some important way, critical race theory, critical race studies, those things had to be somehow put down, killed, if they would have their way. And so just to close this opening section, you have then one of the major voices in this sort of extreme right today making claims of the kind that, critical race theory, critical race studies work is un-American. That's a very dangerous statement. And we can sort of explore some of that later on.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'll later on circle back to ask you something that you mentioned in the book about racial literacy.
Yeah.
I'll ask you with specific reference to something that you've written that I'm fascinated by. So, David, tell us about your book.
Yes, and thank you, Ato, for the introduction, and also thank you, Ian, for what you just said. It is, for a number of reasons, an honor to be sitting here talking to Ian, because 10 years ago, Ian came to Trinity and gave a talk, Black Shakespeare. And so it's really nice to see this work out in the world and inspiring thinking. So Shakespeare's White Others is an amalgamation of things, but I think similarly to Ian, I am interested in the resistance to the work that has been done in the field. And I think Ian gave a very nice summary of the resistance that he has had to face and mentors of mine have had to face over the decades, resistance to the work. And so I see my book as both acknowledging that resistance, but also a rejection of that resistance. I'm very interested in the text in othering whiteness, and so when I think about Shakespeare's white others, I'm centering in the book this sort of covert operation of anti-blackness that happens through whiteness in sometimes the most subtle ways. Um, and I'm also interested in getting people to think and have synergy among the personal, critical, and experiential, because all of that works together and does a lot of work to produce trauma and trauma of different kinds. I think, even to Ian's point and his introduction, there is trauma and has been trauma generated in our field. And so, and even in the profession, I mean, academia has generated lots of trauma for lots of people, particularly women, people of color, and other kinds of marginalized minorities. And so, when I think about this book, it's for me a fight. I see my words as weapons, and I try to think about them in that way. And a fight against the kinds of things that people like Ian, actually got his other book in front of me right now. This, race and rhetoric in the Renaissance, but weapons to fight against white supremacy, to fight against the erasure that happens with the kind of thinking that comes from diverse sets of minds. And so I'll just end by saying that there is overlap too in thinking about people who influenced my work. Toni Morrison's The Origin of Others was incredibly invaluable for my thinking, as well as James Baldwin. He has a great essay, short essay, Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare. And I lead the book toward that because that essay of his is very personal and it's very experiential. And then I conclude the book with a letter that I published in the book that was written in 2002 when I was being racially profiled by police, linking that to Shakespeare, but working my way actually backwards from that letter through the beginning of the book so that I could sort of have some redemption for my 17, 18-year-old self. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. So I'm now going to try and zero in on specific parts of your work to see if, basically, for you to exemplify your arguments through particular. So, for example, David, in your very fine chapter on Hamlet, because what you're trying to do, if I understand it correctly, is to show how intra-race, inside white race itself, there are certain hierarchies. Mm-hmm. But the hierarchies actually also try to, or the hierarchies operate according to certain hidden codes of moral deficit, as well as race, even when, as in Hamlet, there are no people of color on the stage. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Claudius, so I'm trying to take something out of your work. Claudius would be considered an other white because of his moral deficit. He's a murderer. He uses poison, which is considered a tool of feminism, feminine. Poison is feminine, and so on and so forth. He would be considered black, so he's one of the othered white people. So but always that is tied to codes of blackness. So jumping off Claudius, what would you make of Iago?
Oh,
in other words, Iago is ideologically a white supremacist. Mm-hmm. But according to the codes of moral deficit, to an audience viewing him, he's actually blackened. What would you say? Of course, I may be misreading, but apply your method to Iago.
Yeah, so I mean, Iago, and I talk about that in my fourth chapter, Hear Me, See Me, Sex, Violence, Silence, and Othello. And there are levels to this, as you suggest, in the hierarchies. And so Iago is like the epitome of a white other, not just because of his, moral character, but he is an agent of white supremacy, of course, in that text, and an agent of promoting anti-Black racism from start to finish. So he's, for me, one of the easier examples because he's not so hidden in his conduct. And I think what's interesting, we were actually just talking about this yesterday in class because we were doing Othello. And what makes Iago so fascinating to me is how throughout the play he's often referred to as honest Iago, right? And so there's these sort of slippages that can happen where Shakespeare allows these contradictions to exist to help generate the kind of confusion that we see even in our modern world. I think, and I actually do this in a piece I'm working on right now, but Trump is another example of like what I would consider a white other. He is somebody promotes anti-blackness, and he's also, though, revered by certain white people, and that all helps the aims of reinstantiating the racial hierarchy. So what I'm really interested in is thinking about how in between black and white, and I know the hierarchy is much more complex than that, but just isolating it, in between black and white, if we've got the white other position here, then there's always this sort of circulating of anti-blackness happening within just whiteness that does not help the people like us at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. So Iago exemplifies that.
Okay, so Iago, I take point taken, but Iago, according to your argument, because he bears such a heavy moral deficit, which he enacts, all the baiting of Othello and so on. Basically, he's a nasty dude. But according to your argument, he would be, not only is he a white other, he's also an agent of othering. You've already said this. But I think what adds another level of complication is that he himself is discursively black because of the moral deficit of his the performance of his identity. He's masculinist, he's over masculinist, he's misogynist. He's all the things that hegemonic whiteness might wish to disavow. So what I'm wondering is whether he's not a Janus-faced character, in the sense that on the one hand, he's a white man, he's an ideologue of white supremacy, but on the other hand, performatively to an audience, being invited to make ethical assessments, he's actually worse than the person he's trying to draw into damnation. In other words, Iago is both black and white. That's what I'm trying to generate from your reading. That is Iago not both black and white in your terms?
So black, are we talking about lowercase black or
lowercase black? Lowercase black.
Yes.
No, you're talking lowercase black.
Yes. And this is actually making me think, I think back in the 90s, when the term wigger came out, or at least that was when it came to my consciousness. And that term was circulating in my middle school. I went to a predominantly white private school, hoity-toity rich kids. That wasn't my background, but the people who were identified as with the term wigger were people who were seen as embodying or trying to appropriate some kind of blackness that was being rejected by the people who thought, ooh, you like rap, or ooh, you're into like you're not being the ideal example of what it means to be white in this world that we live in this school system that we live in. And so I think to your point, yes, he embodies the black and white. And that's what makes that figure so dangerous, because even in the absence of somebody like me or you or Ian, whatever he's doing can get mapped onto the black male body, for instance, and be interpreted as something that is linked to how we operate in terms of stereotypes.
Okay, the other character that, by the way, both books are very generative in the sense that it makes you think beyond what you're doing, at least to me. I also have a small interest in Shakespeare. As I was reading, I was thinking, this can be shifted this way or moving. How about Shylock? I've always thought that Shylock was a Fanonian character, in the sense of the Fanonian anger, but also carrying what can only be termed a nervous condition. So I have a copy of Merchant of Venice here. if I'm sure you will recall, the trial scene, where Portia comes in disguise and so on, and the Duke turns in some degree of bafflement to ask him, why does he still want the? So he's spurning the promise of multiplying the debt in cash, and he still wants a pound of flesh. But his answer always fascinates me when I read it. He doesn't answer the man directly. And he says, some men there are love not a gaping pig, some that are mad if they behold a cat. And he continues with animal phobias. In other words, the reason why some men like love not a gaping pig is completely irrational. Put my desire for the pound of flesh as an irrational decision, and so on. But in fact, it is not irrational. I interpret him as suffering a kind of phobia, but the phobia produced by the contradictions in Venetian society. So that I don't want to go into what I think are the contradictions, but he's at the interstice of a major contradiction, and that is what flips the switch. Now, is Shylock Black small b?
So, in the context of that play, so I'm glad you asked that question, because I mentioned religion, I mentioned Shylock in the introduction. I also mentioned why I don't go there. But to nutshell answer your question, yes, he is, and certainly could fit into this bucket of the white other. And I just say really quickly, one of the reasons why I left that out is because I'm really interested in getting people to just focus on blackness and black people. We often get sidestepped when people want to bring in like religion or they want to bring in sexuality when we think about intersectionality. And so I deliberately chose not to center that book or that play because I didn't want to distract from my overarching goal, which is we're still trying to get free. And so like, let's get free.
Okay, that's why I was wondering then why Hamlet, because Hamlet's all white people. But let's put that aside. Ian, there is an essay of yours that I read. That's the first thing I read by you. It's from 2013, Othello's Black Handkerchief. Othello's Black Handkerchief. You mentioned it in passing here, but it's a standalone piece. Now, the question I want to ask you is it's a problem that you raise about racial literacy. So racial literacy in the general populace, in the classroom, in the theater, wherever. So I want you to and this is for my own benefit, take me through the process by which you might use Shakespeare's Black Handkerchief to inform the sense of racial literacy, because I think that the racial literacy question is absolutely crucial, especially in a country like America. So racial literacy via Shakespeare's Black Handkerchief, what are your methods of reading? Because that piece is a superlative close reading piece, and it goes against the grain, because most critics, as you rightly noted in the essay, don't think the handkerchief is black. So please take us through racial literacy via the Othello's Black Handkerchief.
Okay, so before I do that, can I go back to the discussion you're having with David? Because I do want to take advantage of the fact that we're both here talking about the work that we've done. And so I want to underscore the connections between the work that David and I are doing, if that's okay. So
Of course,
I'll take a brief moment to do that, and I'll then try to come back to your question. So on the Shylock question, one of the things that I think that, and I admire what David is trying to do, because David is saying, in some sense, rather than think just about colorism as we have inherited that sort of model, which is problematic and so on, let us not forget that on the other side, so to speak, there are shades of whiteness, if one can call them that. And they also have their own sort of function, right? And they produce their own kind of politics too.
Yes.
My reading of Shylock is not that Shylock is black per se, because I think to use black and white, which I think is what David was trying to move us away from doing, it is, I mean, I understand you're saying you're using it discursively, but then we run the danger of really getting caught up in giving some sort of substantial reality to the notion that that idea of blackness is in fact tied to what you call moral deficits, which is something we really want to push back against and not fall into that trap, right?
No,
And
just in
so
the place. No. Just
I
in the
understand,
place.
but I
No,
think that
not in general. Yeah.
I understand, but I'm thinking that what happens in my relationship to teaching Shakespeare is that what happens in the plays and what happens in lives are deeply connected. If not, why are we doing them? Why are we studying them? It becomes, as I said, a niche thing, and I'm not interested in doing a niche thing, right? So if we think about Shylock, one of the things that I wanted to that I do in the essay that I'm doing, which I think then, and David says he doesn't spend much time on this, but I think it bears directly to the kind of work David is doing. And David, of course, you can correct me on this, please. Is that I talk about in the Merchant of Venice, the way that for so many, that really for 400 years, most of us have just omitted that one crucial moment when the contract is being made up, is being designed, and the demand is for a pound of fair flesh, not just a pound of flesh, right? And so whiteness enters into it. And so the question is, if Shylock, why does he demand white flesh? Why is that the thing that is so important to him? And one way to read that, again, one way to read that is to understand that there are in fact levels of whiteness in Venice, which is what David would call other, right?
Other whites. The other
White.
whites.
And so Shai becomes one of those, and yet he's not accorded the benefits, freedoms, or pleasures of that whiteness. And so he's in fact saying, okay, so you've said openly, Mr. Leader of the tribe, right? You have said openly that you spat at me, you reviled me, and so on.
Call me a dog.
Right? And so I'm going to really then zero in on the thing that matters most to you people. And the thing that matters most, we think, is money. Yes, as you're saying, but it is about whiteness, which is a really important form of currency in this play and in this moment. And so what Shylock is doing, and so he's holding them to this. So the animal human thing that you referenced is only important because he's saying, look, you can sell animal flesh, you can do all this stuff with different kinds of animal flesh and eat and cook and so on, but human flesh we don't normally do. But that's what I want. And it seems irrational, but it's politically entirely rational. What he's saying is, I want this because it is my way of getting to and making overtly clear what the real battle is that I am not being given the rights of being also a white man. Now, why is that and what does that mean? So I do think, if David, I think you might agree, there is that sort of intersection, the way our work, or both our work, sort of come to this moment and talk about different forms of whiteness, as I call it. David calls it, other white people. Ultimately, in my work, I make an appeal at the end for forms of whiteness. Now, to your question more directly about racial literacy. In a way, what I've just explained is racial literacy, but with a different play, not through the black handkerchief thing, right? And I say that because it's an essay that I rarely talk about. I've never taught it. I've never taught it myself.
I'm personally disappointed.
I can teach. Well, I had to.
It's
I mean,
okay.
because and it's a little bit odd, sort of talking about what you write. So but nonetheless, I understand why you've asked, and so really, what I mean by racial literacy is the degree to which, again, historically, we don't see race. So to resituate. If I start by talking about this project as being a sort of response to these questions about denial, one could say, oh, that's an old thing. Yes. But as I said, it's old, but it's still very much new and current and living with us now. So it's not as if we have gotten past that. But the second thing is this. What I'm trying to do in this book is not talk about it as an object that's already defined and done. It's the question is now, why? Why are we in such denial? So it's the cause and effect that I'm trying to address in this book, which that's up for grabs. And that's an open conversation that is still going on. My reasoning, suggests that there is a way in which the notion of the reader has really not been properly addressed. We talk about reading and all sorts of studies, but the reader as a real historicized phenomenon, human being, has really not been addressed. And reading has sort of slid in and sort of covered for the fact that we have not talked about the reader, right? And so what I'm doing in this work is to try to recenter the attention on the reader, and in so doing, talk about us as readers today and what we are doing when we participate in engaging texts like Shakespeare. But one of the things that happens is, I suggest, and this is a short version, is we are racially blind because we've been accustomed to not reading race. We're racially illiterate, I argue, right? And so what we want to produce in the classroom is a different scenario in which students, or in the theater, where audiences, in a number of ways, where we can produce what I call racial literacy, where we begin to recognize and begin to see all of the histories, the evidence, and I really want to talk about evidence, that Shakespeare has presented for us that would make us, in fact, better readers of these questions surrounding race that he has. So racial literacy is, in fact, that better reading, if you like, right? And I linked that to the notion of democracy simply because, well, not simply, but I try to make it a simple thing, because I think that because race is such a critical feature of modernity, it's such a critical feature of our democracy. Race is so tied to this notion of what freedom is. Professor Snyder from Yale has just published his new book, called Freedom, and his argument, 2 days ago I think it came out, and his argument there is really about freedom is not just for a singular person, but freedom is about a mutuality. Freedom is about a transaction between and among various and several people. One person can't have freedom. If that's what it is, then freedom doesn't really exist, is what he's arguing, right? It has to be everybody, and then it has to be equitable and for everyone. Literacy, I'm saying, is precisely that. And racial literacy plays a part in our arriving at and daring to approach that notion of freedom.
Okay, so I'm going to pose the same question.
I'm sorry, I didn't get to the handkerchief, but I can't.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. I love that piece, by the way. That's right. But I want to ask the question because I also think about it, not in as beautifully put terms as you do, but about the question of understanding race and its place and so on. So the racial literacy. Now, both of you are great and very subtle readers of all kinds of detail. For example, when you were, contributing to the discussion on Shylock, that Shylock says, I want a piece of white. Most people don't notice that. In fact, universally, he wanted a pound of flesh finished. They don't notice that he specifically asked for a pound of white flesh. And of course, as soon as you are able to pinpoint the white adjective, the whole thing changes. So my question to both of you is, how do you read? Because you just said the reader, but there's been many readers historically. They read earnestly. I mean, we all know, Shakespeareans whom we truly admire, who nonetheless have no racial sensibility. So my question is, how do we read? So that's my question. And it goes beyond Shakespeare studies, in literary studies in general. How do we read? So that's for both of you.
That's
How
right.
do we read?
I think
Starting
David
with it.
also wanted to say something before too, so I'll let him go first.
Yes,
Oh,
Shakespeare,
thank
yes.
you. Well, I'm gonna first of all make a plug for Othello's Black Handkerchief. I was telling Ian that my students we read it for this week, and that piece was for me a sort of mind-blowing moment in my studies as when I was in grad school because it showed the value of close reading. It shows it the value of really careful close reading. And so what you just said, Ado, that they don't notice things like the white flesh, right? I sort of come at that from a slightly different angle by just, again, close reading and adding a word in there. They don't want to notice. There's a reason that these things get omitted or overlooked, and that's doing work in the service of something that is not to like my benefit, for instance. And it's not to the benefit of the person who's doing the erasing either, in the sense that they have an agenda that is designed to maybe either confuse or, to use Ian's words, elide, misconstrue. And that really matters. And that's why when I said, things can seem a little dangerous sometimes, like to me, that's dangerous. Like last night, my students were visibly upset that they have been for years thinking and taught that the handkerchief is white and not noticing that dyed in mummy line and how much that changes readings of the play. And misreading is a choice, I think. Just, sometimes it can come from a place of ignorance, but after a certain point, it is your responsibility to be a careful reader. And how you do that, I'm gonna turn that over to the master. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, and I appreciate David sort of expanding the possibilities of why we misread and how we misread, right? In this particular book, I wanted to give readers the maximum benefit of the doubt, right? By simply saying there is a history that in fact encourages us to not see. There is a history that in fact makes it easy for us not to see. So that's a position I took. David is also quite right that at some point too, we consciously sometimes also do not want to see, and we've seen that also at work, right? So there's a great sense of elasticity there. How do we read? For me, how do I read has to do with what I referenced earlier. At least in the classroom as I teach it, is reading the text and understanding the text as evidence. Very often when I teach a course or a Shakespeare course, I do not begin and dive right in by talking about race. I don't. For example, I'm teaching a course now which is called Introduction, which is not a Shakespeare class. It's called Literature to 1800. And what I said to students is, okay, what we're going to do is ultimately, we're going to do literature 1800, but we're also going to talk about the effects of what happened after 1800. So already I've sort of extended it because we're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. So that's what we're going to do. And I told them so that on week one, if they want to go, I'm not sure if they really know what's in there, right? They can say, I'm out, right? So, but at least I give them enough warning, so whatever. And we've been talking about Petrarch and Wyatt, and that all sounds anodyne, etc. But what I've been saying to them is we're talking about how to read. Because if we're going to do literature 1800, it's not enough to simply say, here it is. What we need to do is talk about how do we read it. And so in the preparation, in these early stages of talking about how we read, what I'm saying is zero in on the text, focus on the evidence, and trust that. Then you can do whatever you want to do within reason, but focus on that. And why am I doing that? I'm doing that because when we get to later texts, whether in this class or another class, and in particular, when a teacher who looks like me or like David walks into a room, there's often the presumption that, oh, he's going to do the race thing because he has some kind of black agenda of some
kind. Yeah, I know. And a bad attitude.
Well, I didn't say that. So what I want to do is to prepare them to trust the process and of the evidence. And I really focus on that word, right? So that when they do come to another kind of text and I say, okay, what about this word? What does this line mean? What do these letters mean? Why is there sibilance here? Why is the structure in this way? And we do all that, which is what we've been doing before in this sort of introductory course. I'm not doing anything new or different. What I've done is lay the foundation for trust. And you should be able to trust your own eyes as a student, your own ears, and the method so far. Because if then suddenly, when we get to Hamlet, and I ask a different kind of question that you think is so different, then my question is going to be, why didn't you object when we were reading Petrarch? Why do you not object when we were doing Sir Thomas Wyatt and having all that wonderful conversation? Yeah. What's different now? So it's you put them in the place where they have to confront their own histories and their own epistemologies.
And can I add in there? I think to that point, people to do that work that Ian's talking about, to do the confronting, that's uncomfortable. And that can make people also feel confused. And so, Ian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I asked you years ago, like, how did you, generate this article from that moment? And you said that you had always noticed the line, or you would pause on it, but you couldn't quite figure it out, and that it was something that stuck with you because it maybe either generated confusion or you hadn't fully investigated. And then once you did, here's Othello's black handkerchief. And it's like when people slow down, and I use slow down as a word that gets, or phrase that Arthur Little tells me all the time, that's really helpful because you are able to interrogate these moments that you overlook. The same thing happened for me, and I would say in part thanks to this moment in Ian's work where Cleopatra is, Shakespeare's Cleopatra is presented as black, but there's a moment when I'm not Ian.
Ian too. He's deeply implicated.
Antony refers to her as a lady with a white hand. And that becomes a very curious moment. And I pause on that in my chapter because I'm like, wait a minute, what's happening here? And there's some really interesting race work happening there, and erasure happening too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last words. What do you hope your books will do in the world? I mean, they are already messing up with my mind, but that's a minor detail. What do you think your books? What do you hope? Not to think. What do you hope your books will achieve in the world of learning? Starting with David.
That's such a big, great question. I hope that my book will inspire, first and foremost, people to get uncomfortable. My teaching philosophy is built on what I call productive discomfort. And so if you are engaging with me or my work and you're not made to feel uncomfortable, then I feel like I haven't done my job, because that's how we learn, that's how we grow. And so that's one thing I hope. But I also hope that it gets people, all people, because even Black people, Latino people, Asian people render whiteness visible, or invisible rather. And I want people, as Ian's doing that work, other people in our field, Arthur Little, Ayanna Thompson, Kim Hall, etc. I want people to realize that not seeing whiteness is also a choice that they make. And there's a reason that they do that. And the last thing I'll say here is, I give my students this, what I call a scene isolation assignment. And they have to drop into just one scene in the text and talk about what's happening with race. They can do that with Othello. They can do it with Titus. You get them to Hamlet, and it's like, there's no race. Like, what's going? And I'm like, no. We all have gendered bodies. We all have race bodies, whether we like it or not. That's the house we inherited, and we live in this world. And so it takes some work, but training yourself to see. That's what I want people to do.
So, Ian?
That's lovely. My closing section of the book actually states what I want to see happen. This idea of racial literacy, as you pointed out, Ato, is really important, because the truth is, if we're asking students, and a lot of us teach a diverse body of students, right? So if we're going to ask them to do that work, then the point is why? So yes, we can talk about its connection to our history, but for me, the real payoff, sorry for using that sort of odd metaphor, but the real, for me, outcome would really be about how does this transform who you are? And this is something that I remember struggling with when I was an undergraduate. I thought, why am I doing this? I loved what I was doing. I liked reading text and I liked doing all this, dissecting and reading and so on. But what I couldn't understand was why. And nobody told me why. And so I had to discover that for myself. And part of the why has to do with how does this transform you and make you into a better citizen or a better person interacting with others ultimately. And so I close the book by talking about forms of whiteness, meaning, okay, so we have seen how whiteness has worked in the West, and it has not always worked perfectly, to put it euphemistically, but you don't have to continue and perpetuate those forms of whiteness or that history. So the question is, and I'm thinking in particular of my students, how then, having done some of this work, can you rethink who you are and understand whiteness for you in a productive way that can help make society better, that can help make you a better human being and person as well?
By the way, those are great statements about the usefulness of literary study. By the way, there's a lot of talk. What is literature for? Oh my God, all this reading it. But you've actually made a really lucid statement, both of you, about the value, the transformative value, because ultimately we all hope that we are teaching them how to see the world better. So, Ian and David, thank you so much for wonderful. Yes, yes, I have them too. Woohoo! Yes, thank you both so much.
I hope you have yours, David.
Yes,
I
yes,
make a
yes,
fan
yes,
out of
yes,
this.
yes, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank
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 you
you,
you.
both.
Anna. This was
All right, have a nice
wonderful.
day.
I
All right,
enjoyed
thank
myself
you.
very
Thank you
much.
so
Thank you.
much. Great
Bye,
to see you.
bye, bye.